Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and welcome to this Promises Masterclass. We're going to go over pretty much everything when it comes to promises. So first, let's just discuss what the promise object is. Why does it matter? So basically, there's several different built-in types of objects in JavaScript: promises, sets, maps, all sorts of different cool little constructs. Now, the promise is particularly important because it's there to facilitate a synchronous activity. So the idea is JavaScript, by default, by the way it's created, is a synchronous language. So let's create a JavaScript file. Okay, we'll just call this promises.js. So it's synchronous, meaning it does one thing at a time and it does it in order. So if I do console.log 1, let's just do this 2 more times. 2, 3. Okay, now if I run this code, it's going to start from the top, do this first, do this second, do this third. Okay, so it starts from the top, works its way down. So node promises.js. Okay, cool. But sometimes you need to do things out of order. Okay, things have to happen in, for example, you might be doing an API call. The API call may take like a second or two for the data to come back. Does that mean your whole code should just stop and wait until that's done? Well, when you're doing a web application, that would be really not the most pleasant user experience. Imagine that, and that used to be sort of the case where you would have to wait like a long time for your page to load, because if it was loading an image, you'd have to wait for that image to load, then you'd have to wait for the next image to load, and until everything was loaded, you saw nothing. So JavaScript has what's called an event loop built in. So JavaScript still only does one thing at a time. But the idea is that all the tasks are sort of in a line, in a queue. And what promises allow you to do is say, you know what, this thing, so when a promise happens, it tells the JavaScript engine that, you know what, come back to this later. Okay, so this is a thing, we promise you that when you come back later, we'll eventually have an answer for you. Either this will have worked out or it will not. And until then, go back to the rest of the queue. Okay, so let's create a promise. Okay, now so if I were to do here, new promise, and promises are a little convoluted, so I'm creating a new promise. This is a new promise object, and every promise object takes a function. Okay, you often probably won't have to create your own custom promises. Sometimes you might, but most of the time promises are built into the functions you use, like fetch and Axios, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the function that's inside of a promise is given 2 functions, resolve and reject. Okay, and the idea is if the promise does what it's supposed to do, it will resolve, and if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it will reject. Okay, so we're just going to say if 5 is greater than 2, which will be true, we'll say then we'll resolve. And we'll resolve the number 2 because it's 1, 2, 3. Else, reject, it didn't work. Okay, so now let's watch what happens. Okay, now notice this. It still kind of happened in order. And the reason being is because this happened so quickly that it was able to still stay within the queue. But you see now it's wrapped in this promise object. Now let's see what happens if I change the operator. 5 is less than 2, which is false. What do I get instead? I get an error. Okay, and you can see like the error is because the promise was rejected. It throws an error, so I get this error here. Okay, now if this was a more complicated promise, what would happen is that you would see like 1, 3, and actually we can still demonstrate that because right now I'm just console logging the status of the promise. So if I get rid of the console log, I'm just creating the promise. What if I don't want to actually do anything until the promise is actually done? What you do is that the promise has a method called .then, and .then can take two functions. One function, so if it's a success and has the data from the success, so we can console log the success data. Or you can do whatever you want with the data. And then we'll have an error function, which takes the error, and we can do whatever we want with the error. We'll console log the error. So right now 5 is greater than 2, so it should succeed. So right now I'm not console logging the promise, so we're not going to get that second console log now. Instead, the console log will not happen until either the .then, until one of these two functions ends up running. So, and now notice the order. It says 1, 3, 2. Okay, so notice it's out of order. Even though the promise is second, it's third. The reason being is that once it notices the promise, the .then doesn't run until at least one loop has happened, because the promise tells the JavaScript engine, skip this for now, do everything else at least once, and then come back to check if this thing's finished. So in this case, this .then will not run until at least everything else has happened, until we've gone through the loop once. So the code is happening asynchronously. It's not happening in order anymore. It's happening simultaneously in a sense. And this is a very tricky concept, okay? Every JavaScript developer takes a while to really appreciate what's going on in promises. But the idea is, now if I change this operator again, and I make it fail, so if it's 5 less than 2, let's take a look at the result then. Okay, and see, this time I didn't get that whole error because I handled the error. I gave it directions on what to do if there's an error. So see, it ran that function instead. Now, this is one way to do it. You can just pass in two functions. You could also use a separate method. Okay, I could actually just cut this out of here. And I think this way is actually a little bit more cleaner looking. I could also use a .catch. .catch is like the same thing as passing in that second function. It's what happens if there's an error. So I could say, hey, if it succeeds, do this. And if it's a catch, do this. So now if it errors, it didn't work. Okay, and then there's actually a third one, .finally. And what .finally does is it runs either way. So whether the promise succeeds or fails, it'll do the same thing. So in this case, we'll just pass in nothing, and we're just going to say console.log. Either way I run. So now if I run this, see, either way I run. So the promise failed, so the catch ran, but the finally ran too. Now if we change this back to 5 is greater than 2, so that way this part, the resolve, is what runs. I get back the number 2, but either way I run. So finally happens either way. Okay, so .then when it resolves, .catch when it rejects, and .finally either way. And each of them takes a callback where you can just run any code that you want. Okay? But the reason why this is important to kind of understand the timing of these things is that this data, this success data, the data I got back from the successful execution of the promise, is only available in this function. So let's say it's API data. I'd have to do everything I want to do with it in this function. Okay? It's not going to exist outside of the function. And that was definitely something that took me a really long time to appreciate, because I kept trying to like find ways to sneak it out, but no, you just do what you need to do inside the function. Now notice that this kind of syntax is a little funky, okay? The whole .then, .catch, .finally, there's a couple different ways you could do it, okay? But, yeah. But the idea is that there's several functions you'll run into through different libraries, for databases, for API calls, that return a promise. They return a promise, and then you can do what you want with the promise. So, for example, fetch. Now fetch automatically exists in the browser. So let's use the let's go through all the possibilities. Okay, so I'm going to create a new HTML file, index.html. I'm going to give it some boilerplate. First we'll do the Jquery function, which is called ajax. they all do the same thing. Fetch, Ajax, and Axios, they make API calls. So I'm going to go get the jQuery code.jquery.com. And again, as long as you can kind of understand the concept of promises from that last example, you should be able to be good for like the remainder of this video. That was the main thrust. It does take a while to kind of get used to creating your own custom promises. But I'm going to add the jQuery library, so I'm adding the script tag here. And for the sake of expediency, instead of linking a separate JavaScript file, I'm just going to create some script tags right here. So we'll just say h1. This is a test file, just so that way there's some text on the screen. And then we'll create some script tags here in the body, so I can write JavaScript in the middle. And since jQuery is loaded here, I can use the JavaScript here. So we're going to want an API to make a call to. A good one to use is jasonplaceholder.com. JSON placeholder provides some just dummy APIs for you to practice with. So we're going to use this URL here. Okay, and all that you're doing with the API is you're just saying, hey, I want to request the data that this URL gives me back. That's all you're saying. So in jQuery, there's a function called .ajax. Now, if I pass it a URL, it's going to return a promise. Okay, so for example, and let's just confirm that. If I console.log the result of this function, okay, let's see what happens. Save. And let's open it up with live server. Let's open up the console so you can see we see this object. The object is what we console logged. And we see all this data. Okay, and let's just see. So you see here, on fulfilled, on rejected, on progress. Those are that's the then function right there. So you can see like this is like a promise object. Let me see if it gives you a little bit more information. Always. So see, it has all these different methods already built into it. And see all the actual response is right here in response.json. So it got the response pretty quick. But it's not really like a very funly organized object. Not what we want. Okay, this promise. So generally what you do, instead of using the data from the function, because the function, all it does is return that promise object, what you do is you use those .then functions. So since Ajax will return a promise, I can do a .then on that promise, and then I get the data back, because again, you're passing in a function, and we'll say I want to console.log the data. And if for some reason this failed, we'll do a .catch, and I can say error, console.log the error. And again, it's because you can always chain functions. So since this function returns a promise, I can use the methods of a promise, which are .then, .catch. .then also returns a promise, so I can chain .catch off of it. So this is why it's important to like know function return values, because if a function returns an array, then I can chain an array method. If a function returns an object, I can use an object method. You can always use the methods of the object that a function returns and just kind of keep chaining off of them. So now if I go back to the browser, I see that I just logged the data that I got back from the API. And if you are making API calls, a good thing to know is that here in the network tab, you can see the status of your API calls. So I can take a look for that API call to JSON placeholder. I'll just refresh the page. Here, I think it's in here. Nope, that's not it. Maybe this one's it. Yeah, this is it. So here's the API call that and you can see the data for the API call. This is a really useful tool for troubleshooting. Things that I generally would look for is like, is the URL I made an API call what I thought it was? Is the method, are all these details what I expected them to be? If there's an error, I would take a look at the response here to see if maybe the error message, the response message has maybe more details as to the error. Because sometimes it'll just say there's an error in the console here, but you can find some more details here about what the error is, so you can figure it out. Okay, very cool. And cool. And again, you're just passing it a URL. So again, if I did this, so like I could just append, take out the 1 here, because it's supposed to be the ID of the blog post, and I just add num. I could just, you know, it doesn't matter. I don't, you know, I just use this variable called num. I create a variable called num. And we'll say equals 2 now. Okay, and then basically it's going to make the API call to the URL that's created from this expression. So if I go back here, I'll see that I got a different response. So see, that's a different one than the one we got before. See, it's with the ID 2. And if I go back to network, I see the request to 2. So that's the URL. Because I got assembled, we assembled the string. So when you're doing API calls, you can do some pretty dynamic stuff by learning how to manipulate strings to manipulate the URL you're making the API request to. So keep that in mind. Very important skill to have. Cool. So that's how the ajax function works. It's actually pretty straightforward. You just use this $ajax function, pass in the URL you're making an API call, and then just do a .then to specify what you're going to do with that data. A .catch what happens if something goes wrong. And that's pretty straightforward. Now the problem with ajax is that in order to use the ajax function, you have to add jQuery. So that means you're going to add all of jQuery. And if you're not using the jQuery methods, let's say you just don't want to use jQuery, then loading jQuery just to have the ajax function is a little bit overkill. But JavaScript's got you covered. There's a built-in function called fetch. It does the same thing. Okay, it's going to return a promise. The only issue with fetch is that the first promise returns raw data. So it doesn't return the actual final object, it returns raw data. So in this case, you're going to need 2 .thens, and you'll see why. Because the first then is going to return the raw data. Okay, just think of it as like that. We'll just call it raw. And the thing is that we don't want the raw data. It's not very helpful to us. But just to show you that you're getting it raw. So we're going to console log that raw data and see what we get in the terminal. So on that first then, let me refresh. I have a typo somewhere. So fetch .then raw. Oh yeah, I'm missing a parentheses here. Okay. And you see I get this response object. Okay. But see, like, that's not my data. If I go in here in the body, I find this object called a readable stream. Now what's that? A readable stream is an object that can be read. It's like raw, like binary to be read. That's probably the best explanation I can give you without getting into streams. But that's not going to be really useful for us. But readable streams have a method that we can take advantage of. So we can instead do raw.json. So this JSON method is built into streams. So what we're doing is we're converting that stream into a JavaScript object. And this function also returns a promise, because .then returns a promise. So then I can chain another .then after it. So that way whatever this function returned, which again this function is returning the result of raw.json. And if I want to be more explicit about it, I could do this, just to make it super, clear that this function is returning the result of raw.json. So that gets passed on to this .then. So then here's my final data. And that one's going to be like console.log the data. And then I can do a .catch just in case there's an error. And it just console logs the error. Okay. So basically, this function returns the first promise, which this .then chains off of, which then returns the converted data. So, but since it's wrapped in a .then, that turns it into a promise. So then that promise, this .then chains off of that promise, and this one's going to receive the result of this, and then we'll be able to console log the final data. So fetch works the same way, but you have this extra intermediate step, just because of what the function underneath is returning. But it's just a promise. You're just doing a .then. When this promise finishes, you do a .then. When this promise finishes, you do another .then. It's the same idea. Okay, so if we go back here, see there's the data. Okay. Now, just to kind of, once again, just make it clear that, again, things are happening in a different order. If I console.log hello right after all of this, and again, it's not inside of this construct. It's not inside this fetch, and it's all its dot thens. It's outside of it. Watch the order that these things happen. See, the hello happens first. Because again, it's always going to go through that loop one time before the promise is allowed to resolve. So no, every dot then, every dot catch is going to happen until after all the other code runs. This is why you can't reference the data in the rest of your code. The only time you can use the data is in the dot then, because all the rest of your code will have run before the dot then runs. Okay, cool. Now you can see like this. Well, we'll show you one more before we go to the whole async await deal. Okay, so another thing we can do is we can use Axios. Axios is also popular. So fetch is built into the browser. Okay, if you want to use fetch in the back end, so like in Node, you would then have to install Node fetch. So fetch is not natively part of Node. It is natively part of the browser. So always worry about like, where am I running my JavaScript? Am I running it in the browser, which means I can see it here in the terminal, or am I running it in Node, which means I'm running it in the terminal here like I was earlier? Okay, Node and the browser are two different environments for you to run JavaScript code, and they don't all have the same features or work within the same context. So just be cognizant of that. Okie dokie, let's go find Axios. Axios script tag. Here we go. Axios. I'm going to use the script tag. Here we go. I will copy the script tag. And I will put that in the head here. So that will make Axios available. And the way Axios works is going to be more similar to Ajax, where you only need one dot then. So I can just change this to Axios, still pass in the URL. The only difference is that now I don't need this. This will work just like that, where it's just with the dot then and the dot catch. This is why some people prefer Axios over fetch, because they don't have that intermediate dot then. So it's simple like Ajax without the, but here's the only difference. Like notice like this doesn't look the same way you expected it. This is not the way the data looked before. Because what Axios does is that it returns you this object with a bunch of metadata that you could use, and then stores the data in a subproperty called data. So really, in Axios, if you want to get the data, you always have to take whatever your data is and then look for a subproperty called data. So data.data. And then you get this. Okay, so just keep in mind like all of these methods work for making any API call you want. So if you're not using jQuery, you're probably not using Ajax. If you really don't want to have to add a third-party library, then you probably won't want to use Axios. So then fetch becomes your go-to. But again, fetch has that intermediate step where you have to do that second dot then. While Axios, you only have to do one dot then, because it just kind of gives you the response. But again, your payload is going to be inside that data property. So as long as you just kind of keep all that straight, those are your main ways to do API calls. There's other libraries out there, but those are the sort of the three big ones. And they can do more complicated things. Okay, so if you read the documentation, if you want to make other types of requests, other types of API calls that are more complicated, you can do that. But you read the documentation to learn how to do like a post or put or all these other types of requests. Now the next piece is, again, this whole .then syntax is kind of hard to read. So what they did is they eventually added something that makes it a little bit easier. Okay, but I'm going to switch back to Node. So I'm going to go back to this promises.js. And what I'm going to do is just to show you that if we wanted to use fetch, you would have to install it. I'm going to create a package.json, npm init-y, so that we can install stuff. And then I'm going to install npm install node fetch. And I'll also install Axios when I'm at it. Okay, so now I can use either. So here in promises.js, I can const, first let's bring in fetch. So node fetch equals require node fetch, because this is how things work in Node. and const Axios equals require Axios. We have to import the library. Again, a bit of a different context. When we're working in the front end, we bring in the libraries through script tags in the header. When we're working in the back end with Node, we use these require statements to bring in the libraries we've installed. But now I have access to both functions. Now the cool thing about, so if I copy this over, it should just work. So let me just do that first. So I'm going to copy over this Axios call. So if I run this code, it should run, but now it's going to be running in the terminal, not in the browser. So node scratch, or no, node promises.js. Num is not defined. Oh, that's right, I have num over here. Let's just change this. Let's just put this back to 1. And see, it made the API call and it got the data. Same as before. But you see, again, the syntax isn't the cleanest. The way we can clean the syntax is by wrapping our API calls in another function. So we're going to make a function called API call. And we use the async keyword. So it's async. And this what makes it an async function. So this tells JavaScript that I'm going to be working with promises in this function. So it gives me a little extra leeway to work with them. So now if I were to copy this in there, let's watch what I can do. So this line, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of copy each line. So before this line was this, and now it will become this. We'll say const data equals await Axios. So instead of writing like doing a promise and waiting for the dot then, this kind of does both. This says, okay, this await, you use it in front of statements that return a promise. So since Axios returns a promise, the await says, don't do this assignment until this is finished. So it's like a dot then, but you do it in one line. So the data will equal the result of what the promise resolves to. So it waits for the promise to resolve, and then it does the thing. Okay, so then instead of a dot then, so I'll comment this out. So instead of the dot then, what we do is we now just have the data. So I can just console.log data.data. And see, that looks a lot more like normally written JavaScript. And that's the nice thing about async await. It's a lot more like cleaner looking. But you have to do it in a async function. So you have to write an async function, and then I got to make a call to that async function. So API call. And let's just get rid of this. So I created the function, and then I make a call to the function. And see there, it still works. Very nice. But that looks a lot cleaner. Cool. Now let's just show you how that would work like with fetch. So fetch. And again, so we would do const response equals await fetch. So then that would be the response, but again, you have that intermediate step. So we do const data equals await response.data. I mean, like response.json. And then we have the data, console.log data. And if I run this API call, see, it does the same thing. That's pretty cool. Okay, so that's pretty cool. That's pretty nice. Okay, you can write much cleaner asynchronous code using async await. That's the only purpose. It doesn't do anything different than just using the dot thens and the dot catches. It just offers you sort of a nicer way to write it. But certainly, I kind of like how clean that looks. One last piece. Let's talk about promise.all. Okay, so let's say you want to make multiple API calls. Okay, so let's say const the first, and so I go const one fetch, and then this one will fetch the one post, and I'll do this 2 more times. So we're gonna do this 3 times. So what I'm doing here, so you notice I'm not like wrapping it in a function. I'm not using await or anything like that, and I'm saving it to a variable. This variable is going to equal the promise. because again, fetch returns a promise. I'm not doing a dot then or anything. So this will be 2. This will be 3. This will be 2. This will be 3. Okay. And actually, you know what? I'm going to change this to Axios so that way there's no intermediate step to keep it simple. Axios. 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 So what this is going to do is going to run the function and return the promise. Now these 3 vary, but I don't really want to do anything until I have all 3 promises finished. So then what I can do is I can run promise.all and then say pass in an array with 1, 2, and 3, the 3 promises, the 3 variables. So what this does, it's going to create a promise that wraps these 3 promises and will not finish until these 3 promises are done. So now I can do a dot then off that promise. And this will have all the data inside of it. We'll just say console.log all. So if you need to, like, let's say you want to make 2 or 3 API calls, but you really don't want to do anything until they're all finished, then you would do this, promise.all, and I can just go node promises, and see I get this array of the data from each one. Okay. You know, and again, Axios gives you that bigger object. So if I wanted to simplify it a little bit, I could just do this, something like this, like dot then data, and then just have it return just the data part, data.data, and I can just copy that to the end of each one, because dot then returns a promise as well. So if I do that, see I have an array of the 3 pieces of data. Because promise.all doesn't resolve until all 3 promises resolve. There's also, I think, let's see here, yep, there we go. So all, waits till all of them. Race, if I remember right, waits till the first one resolves. So whichever one resolves first, I think then it stops doing the other ones. Let me just double check. We'll check apply, and the other ones don't matter. But let's go take a look at those methods real quick just to double check. So promise.race. Promise.race method returns a promise that fulfills or rejects as soon as one of the promises in the iterable fulfills or rejects the promise. Okay, so basically the minute one of them resolves, it's resolved. Okay, or the first one rejects. Okay, and let's see, here's some of the other methods. So promise.any takes an iterable of promise objects, and as soon as one of the promises in the iterable fulfills, so this one will resolve as long as one of them resolves. Okay, while race, on the other hand, like if one errored before the other 2 resolved, it would throw an error. And then resolve, let's see what that one does. Method returns a promise object and is resolved with a given value if the value is a promise. Oh, that's just the resolve function. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty good. So essentially, when you're working with like multiple promises, you have promise.all, promise.any, and promise.race to play with. So if I did promise.race, we can see which one kind of fulfills first. So one fulfilled first. And he should give me back the same result. Okay, so maybe you just want to see like, okay, whichever one gets, so maybe you have like different sources of the data. So you make the calls to all the different sources of the data and you say, hey, whoever gives me the data first, that's what I'm going to use. So that's like a little bit more advanced. And again, I would only worry about those if you need all the promises to be handled at the same time. Okay, you could also nest promises inside of each other. Okay, so I could have done this instead. So let's copy this and then delete all this. This will be the last piece. Okay, let's talk about like nested API calls. So if I did an API call to this Axios thing here, dot then, and we'll just say we'll call this blog post 1 because that way we can kind of keep track of which one's which. So in this case, I'll write a longer function. So then here I want to make another API call. So I'll do another one, except for this one's for blog post 2. So I'm just nesting it. So then I do another .then, and now there's 2 here. And then I will do another blog post, and I will do a .then on that one. So that's the third one. And see, they're just nested. They're just one's right instead of the other. So when the first API call resolves, it makes a second API call, and when that resolves, it makes a third API call. And that's going to be 3. And then once we get to this third one, then I actually want to use the data. So we'll just console.log. And then I'll put the data for all 3, because since they're nested inside of each other, always variables exist within the curly brackets they're created. So since this 1 is created within this set of curly brackets, it's available to all, all these .thens. 2 is available to all, is available inside of here, and 3 is available inside of here. So in this curly bracket right here, I have access to all 3. So I can take advantage of that and be like, okay, 1, 2, 3. That should be the result of all 3 results. I'm going to map it because I want to, again, the Axios gives you that object with all that data. I just want the data property. So I'm going to say map. We'll just say x equals x.data, or return x.data. And then that should give me what I want. Because again, I'll have my 3 Axios return objects here. The data is going to be in a property called data. So this will create a new array of just the data property. And there you go. See, it works. So it just depends. Again, do you care about all of them finishing at the same time? Then you want the promise.all. If you want them to happen in a particular order sequentially, like do this first, then do this, then nesting the promises will make more sense. Okay, so that's a lot about promises. You might want to watch this video once or twice to kind of let everything fully gel, because some of the things I talked about later in this video will help make some of the stuff I talked about earlier in the video make more sense. And then and then once you kind of appreciate the stuff earlier in the video, the stuff later in the video will maybe be, it's kind of like a good movie where you have to watch it 2 or 3 times to kind of get all the layers, because there's a lot of layers when it comes to promises. But once you really get the handle of promises, really your power in JavaScript becomes pretty amazing, because you're able to really kind of control the order in which tasks occur at a higher level and handle all sorts of asynchronous processes with ease. It's powerful. So I'll see you guys later. This is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. If you liked the video, do like, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure to head over to devnursery.com and sign up for the Slack and Discord channel. I'll see you all later. Have a good one, and ciao.